Okay, take two because I can't talk a lot of the time. And, you know, it's a Halloween season episode. We're doing a review of I Know What You Did Last Summer, released in 1997. And I'm going to actually go over the list of movies that I'm going to review next week. And it's going to be a fun week because I was kind of scrambling. I was thinking, oh no, I don't have enough scary movies that I'm going to cover during the Halloween season. So I actually compiled a list of episodes that are ready for me to record. I've gathered up all my notes. I did watch all of these movies at some point, you know, uh, in my life, and I took notes about them. And so here are the ones that I'm going to cover next week. We've got Halloween Resurrection. I'm going to be reviewing that with my brother. It's considered a flounder of a film. It's considered one of the worst in the Halloween franchise, but I'm going to give it a little bit of a twist. I'm going to be talking with my brother Ryan about ways in which you could actually enjoy that stinker of a movie. And, it's actually not even that bad of a movie, in my opinion, even though people think it's like the worst in the franchise. I think there are two movies that are actually worse than that in the Halloween multiverse. And so that's going to be fun. We're going to delve pretty deep into what makes that movie both good and bad, especially the bad, but we're going to twist the bad elements into something that makes the movie a little bit more enjoyable. And I'm also going to look at In the Heart of the Sea. So that's a movie about the real life whale attack that actually inspired Moby Dick. So it's a bit of a monster movie in a way, but it's also like a real life story. Of course, fictionalized a little bit for Hollywood, maybe even fictionalized quite a bit. But we're going to enjoy that one, and hopefully I will inspire you to check it out. Even if you don't like it, you could say you gave it a try. And I'm also planning to review Phantasm next week. The original from 1979. It's another classic, and be on the lookout for those. I debated whether or not I wanted to share the list of movies I'm going to cover, but who knows, maybe doing so will help build anticipation and make these reviews seem like a little bit more of an event. And let's look at the movie that we're supposed to be talking about here. And it's just picture it as the 4th of July, a dark coastal highway, four friends, a secret, and a man with a hook. So, yes, we're looking at one of the great slashers from the late 1990s, the era of glossy teen horror, and the return of the slasher flick with I Know What You Did Last Summer. So, the setup is pretty straightforward. The movie was released in 1997. I Know What You Did Last Summer came hot on the heels of Scream, and not by coincidence, it was written by the same guy, Kevin Williamson, and directed by Jim Gillespie, or is it Gillespie? I don't know. I've never heard that, you know, name pronounced properly for my ears. Is it Gillespie or Gillespie? I don't know. But anyway, the movie's based on a 1973 novel by Lewis Duncan. Though fans of the book were in for a surprise, the film apparently stripped out much of the psychological mystery and replaced it with straight up slasher thrills. And of course, a killer with a hook. So I can't say that I've read that book, and I bet a lot of people out there didn't know that it was based on a book like that, but it was. And that's a sort of trivia aspect of this review. So you may have learned something today. I don't know. Anyway, you've got four teens, Julie, Ray, Helen, and Barry. They're driving home from a night of partying when they accidentally hit a man on a dark road. Panicked, they dump the body in the ocean and swear to never speak of it again. But 1 year later, someone knows. They start getting the chilling message, I know what you did last summer. And it's pretty clear that these people, they're not exactly heroes. They hid the accidental killing of a man because they were driving kind of recklessly. And after they start getting that message about I know what you did last summer, the bodies start piling up. And the cast is really 90s royalty. If you made a Mount Rushmore of late 90s teen stars, or perhaps 20-year-olds playing teens, then this cast could potentially fill that Mount Rushmore. You've got Jennifer Love Hewitt playing Julie, who is the conscience of the group. Sarah Michelle Gellar is Helen Shivers, the beauty queen with a surprisingly tragic arc. You have Ryan Philippe as Barry, the hot headed jock, sort of the annoying character of the bunch, at least the most annoying character, I would say. And Freddie Prinze Jr. as Ray, the good guy trying to hold everything together. As for supporting roles, you've got Bridget Wilson, Johnny Galecki, and Muse Watson as the fisherman killer named Ben Willis, one of the most memorable slasher villains of that decade. So, of the iconic moments of this movie, there is one scene that everyone remembers. Julie is standing in the middle of the road. She spins around and screams to the heavens, "What are you waiting for?" That shot is pure 90s horror gold. It's dramatic, over the top, and potentially unforgettable. It's a fun moment from this movie. It's about as memorable as any of the kills, actually. And then there's the killer himself, the fisherman in a slicker with his hook in hand. It's a perfect horror image, simple, scary, and instantly iconic. By the time the credits roll, Julie also gets another ominous message, and it's proof that the nightmare isn't over. It's a perfect sequel setup, and of course, we got one. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer came out the next year, followed by I'll Always Know What You Did Last Summer in 2005, and most recently a TV reboot hit Amazon Prime in 2021. Well, that's not the most recent one. There was actually one in 2025 that I forgot about. Yeah, so a little bit of an oversight on my part that I didn't include that in my script. But anyway, the franchise kept on going, and I have long had this joke where I said they should have made a movie. I no longer care what you did last summer. It's a sort of joke that the premise might be wearing a little bit thin. You know, it, I tend to annoy people by making jokes like that. The super fans, they don't like if I suggest that a movie premise might be growing a little bit stale or something, even though I'm, sort of making fun of it or whatever. I'm not seriously critiquing the movie franchise. And I'm going to gradually get through all of those movies. I have seen the sequel, and I was actually writing recaps of the Amazon Prime show. I didn't follow the entire series because it ended up getting canceled. So I stopped writing recaps of it for one of the websites I was writing for when I heard that it was getting, axed. Or I guess I could say hooked in this case. But I did at one point follow that show, and I plan on watching all of the other installments, and I'm sure I'll eventually, review those too as I go through them. And the critics, as you might expect, they had mixed reactions to this movie. Many compared it unfavorably to Scream. It is interesting because Scream was an example of the same, really the same mood that was sort of making horror fun again. Obviously, Scream was directed by Wes Craven, and Wes Craven was actually a little bit responsible for saving horror in the 90s. You had Scream, but also New Nightmare, which revitalized the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and sort of gave Freddy a more popular send off than what he had in Freddy's Dead. Even though I actually like the movie Freddy's Dead, some people they still hate it to this day. And I saw New Nightmare in the theater, and it was good, but it I don't think it was quite as good as Scream. And honestly, I don't know if I like that movie more than I Know What You Did Last Summer. So Roger Ebert famously criticized this new wave of slashers, saying audiences seemed to cheer for the killers instead of fearing them, and he called it, quote, a very scary experience. So he was a little bit of a wuss sometimes. I'm just gonna say it. I'm gonna put that out there. You know, as somebody who was supposed to be a horror fan, sometimes he was a little bit too namby pamby about things like calm down, Roger. These are just movies after all. And all these years later, there's still not very much evidence that movies that are featuring killers or whatever or maniacs, there's no evidence to my mind that they are somehow leading people so far down a darkened path. I mean, you can probably find some examples of people who were supposedly influenced by scary movies to commit violent crimes or something like that. But there's always something a little bit off about people like that anyway. So you never really know what could trigger somebody into a series of murders or something like that. So to to pin that sort of behavior on movies, or to say that Ozzy Osbourne inspired people to end their lives, it's a little bit of a cop out, really, because there typically are far more complex dynamics at play. Like, people usually have they have some failures in their lives, or they were, of course, abused in some way, or they just feel bitter about how life turned out. So they might want to become like famous in a way, or of course, they might just be depressed, or any number of things. Or let's face it, I mean, it's a bit of a politically incorrect term to throw around, but some people are just kind of crazy. So the Roger Ebert thing about blaming slasher movies for any sort of negative behavior, I, I'm not really on the same page when it comes to that sort of thing. Things are always a little bit more complex, and really, when those things do happen, it's more of a collective failure of our, I guess you could say, species, to remind people that these are just you know media depictions, and it's a failure to not get people to understand that, hey, you're not supposed to try this at home. So there are bigger issues than just saying that, oh, cheering for the killer is causing societal collapse or something like that. But anyway, I'll get off of that soapbox. I feel like I've said enough on that. And audiences, they view things differently anyway. The real big horror fans, they understand movies like this. I think I Know What You Did Last Summer made over $125 million on a $17 million budget, which means it was actually a pretty successful film. It became a pop culture hit, and it really established the late 90s as a golden age for glossy horror, possibly in some ways even more than Scream, because even though Scream was obviously a huge movie, when you have more than one success story, well, then that keeps the ball rolling. You kind of need that initial success, but also you need something that sort of rides that wave and really establishes that a new age is underway. And in this case, it was the 1990s teen slasher flick. And it holds cult classic status, the kind of movie you rewatch perhaps every October with a blanket, popcorn, and maybe a bit of guilt. And in this case, hey, you might not watch it in October, maybe you'll watch it as a summer movie because, well, the word summer is right there in the title. So it's really a good movie to watch at any point in the year. So I know what you did last summer isn't perfect. I'm not saying that. It's a product of its time. You have beautiful people in it, small towns, and big secrets. But it captures that strange mix of teenage invincibility and some paranoia that made late 90s horror so much fun. Scream also had some of that paranoia too, and that this mood of these horror fans are uh they're gonna go crazy and they're going to be corrupted. There are these bad youths out there who are you know a part of the problem in society. I think both this movie and Scream really kind of play that up for yucks, so to speak, because you had things like the Satanic Panic that happened in the 80s and 90s. And I don't know if you remember the fear mongering about the Columbine school shooting at the time. If you were wearing a leather trench coat or something like that, you would be seen as a possible maniac because the Columbine shooters wore that. So I'm sure there were some kids out there who were buying trench coats specifically for that reason, to drive fear into people. You know, that there were a bunch of scares that happened since then, of course, like the 2016 clown rampage or whatever it was called. The all those clown sightings that were happening. So that this is stuff people have been doing for a long time. It can be both tongue in cheek, and also some maniacs out there might actually make it into something more serious. So that this movie and Scream really kind of make fun of that. The way in which the youth are blamed for everything, yet also the fact that there are also some dangerous and uh, potentially maniacal young people out there as well. And in this case, the young people are more irresponsible than in Scream. In Scream, they're just like the ghost face figure is actually more of an outright maniac, but in this case they're dangerous more because they're just throwing all caution to the wind. And it's really playing into the parental fears about, our kids are all rotten, they're always going to be causing problems out there. And sure enough, there are some kids who cause problems, but so do the adults too. And I think that really these teen slasher movies were a way to put a fresh face and a fresh spin on the horror genre. And even now, decades later, the echo of that whispered message still hits hard. I know what you did last summer. It's like a classic slogan that is both a threat and a promise. That's like we're gonna pay the price for any sort of evil deeds we have done. It's a classic revenge tale, and that's one of the reasons why it's a hit of a movie, even all these years later. And speaking of hits, this movie I think also had some success with the soundtrack. I don't know how successful the soundtrack was, but I do like the music on this. It's not as good as the music on the Crow soundtrack, which was another 90s great film and a thriller. If I had more time, maybe I would review that for this Halloween season, but I don't think I'm going to have time for that one. But maybe I'll do an episode on great soundtracks. And I think this movie might actually, make that list. Well, anyway, I've been rambling. I've probably lost a few people along the way because I tend to go off on tangents and make annoying reviews as a result. And hopefully, some of you understood what I said throughout the episode. I don't know how much sense every point that I raised even makes, but that's what happens when you veer off script. Some people value the spontaneity aspect of it. They're like, I don't even want a podcaster who writes out a script and takes notes and whatnot. I want somebody who's just shooting straight from the hip. So I guess that's kind of what I'm doing here a little bit. But anyway, my name was Wade. In case you didn't know, and if you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, hit like, follow it, and I'm sure I'll be keeping the horror streak alive with other classics. And eventually I'll get around to the faculty or urban legend, stuff like that. But that might be for next Halloween or maybe some other time, later on. Uh, I don't know when exactly I'll get around to those, but until next week, watch your back and don't take shortcuts on dark roads.